first time a knight fell from his horse in full armor, he did not get up. Not because he was dead, though he might have been, but because the weight pressing down on his chest made it impossible to roll over, to find purchase with his gauntleted hands, to push himself upright. His own body had become a trap. The horse had stumbled, or perhaps been struck, and the knight had gone over its shoulder in a slow arc of steel and chain mail, landing on his back in the mud of the tournament field. Around him, the crowd cheered not for him, but for the other man who had won the pass. The fallen knight lay there, winded, while attendants rushed forward like beetles to pry him open. It took 4 of them to lift him to his feet. His armor, polished that morning to a blinding gleam, was now caked with wet earth, and the first rust spots would appear by evening. That image has stayed with me since I first encountered it in a chronicle from the early 14th century, and I cannot shake the feeling that it tells us something deeper than just a mishap on a muddy field. What we see as gallantry, the shining plate, the plumed helm, the war horse stamping and snorting, was for the man inside it a daily agony of heat, chafing, thirst, and suppressed terror. The armor of a late medieval knight could weigh between 60 and 100 pounds, distributed across shoulders, neck, and spine. It was a mobile prison. The helmet alone left the wearer half blind, with a field of vision so narrow that he could not see an attacker coming from the side unless he turned his entire torso. For a man on foot, the weight was bearable for short bursts on horseback, under the midday sun, with blood trickling from a head wound. It became a slow form of drowning. But no one was allowed to admit that. The code of chivalry, that vast unwritten law of honor, forbade complaint. A knight did not say he was tired. He did not say he was afraid. And he certainly did not ask for help taking off his armor to relieve himself, a task so complex that a fully armored man often resorted to wetting himself rather than enduring the humiliation of being unlaced by servants in front of his peers. I have no definitive answer for why this was considered noble rather than absurd, only guesses. But the guess that comes closest, I think, is that the whole system was built on the illusion of invincibility. And the moment a knight admitted vulnerability, the entire feudal pyramid would tremble. If the warrior class confessed that its gear was unbearable, that its horses were terrified, that its body was as fragile as a peasant's, then what was the point of knighthood? So the lie was maintained. And every morning, a man pulled on a padded gambeson, then the chainmail hauberk, then the steel plates, and cinched them all tight, and tried not to think about the fact that he might die in this metal coffin without ever having felt the sun on his skin for the last time. Meanwhile, a few miles away, the peasant was waking up too. He had no armor. He had a tunic of rough wool, a pair of leather shoes that would be soaked through by midday, and a stomach that was rarely full. His work began at dawn and ended at dusk, and it was brutally physical, plowing, sowing, reaping, thrashing, hauling water, splitting wood. There was no romance in it, no glory, and the landlord took a large slice of whatever he grew. But here is the thing that makes me pause. The peasant could take off his wet shoes at the end of the day. sit by the fire and eat a bowl of pottage and say nothing to anyone. He could grunt with exhaustion, and no one called him dishonorable. He could run away if a raid came, hiding in the woods, and no one would call him a coward because no one expected him to fight. The peasant owned his exhaustion. It was private. The knight's exhaustion was public property, worn on his sleeve like a badge that was not supposed to be a badge of suffering. To me, the most unsettling part is not the physical hardship itself. Both men suffered in different currencies, but the isolation that came with the knight's role. A peasant worked alongside his family, with neighbors, in a community where everyone shared the same rhythm of labor. A knight lived among other knights, yes, but they were competitors as much as comrades. Every tournament was a contest, every war campaign a gamble for ransom and reputation. There was no solidarity in the way we might imagine. If a knight showed weakness, if he lost a duel, if his horse was killed, if he surrendered too readily, the others did not comfort him. They remembered. The humiliation would be recounted in the hall for years. So the knight learned to suffer alone, smiling through bloody teeth, while his armor rusted from the inside because his sweat never fully dried. When I first read an account of a knight who died of heat stroke during a summer campaign, I was struck by the matter-of-factness with which the chronicler recorded it. He fell from his saddle, his face turned purple, his companions removed his helm and poured water over his head, but it was too late. That was it. No funeral eulogy about his bravery, just a note, like a weather report. And I wondered if the peasant who died of a fever in his cot got more dignity. His family mourning him, the village priest saying a mass, a wooden cross carved by a neighbor. The knight's body was probably stripped of its valuable armor before it was cold, and what was left was buried in unconsecrated ground, or simply left where it lay if the battle was still going. The economics of knighthood, too, are a slow horror that I will return to later, but let me give you just a taste here. A full suit of armor in the 14th century cost roughly the equivalent of a small farm, a year's income for a modest lord, several years' income for a lesser knight. The horse was another fortune, and he would go through several in a lifetime. The armor needed constant maintenance, oiling, strapping, replacement of broken rivets. A sword could cost as much as a cow, and all of this had to be paid for by the knight himself, out of land rents that were often too small to cover it. Many knights went deeply into debt, mortgaging their few fields, borrowing from moneylenders at ruinous interest, and eventually losing everything if they were captured and had to raise a ransom. The peasant, by contrast, owed his lord a fixed share of his harvest. He could not become rich, but he could not become ruined in a single afternoon by the loss of a horse. The knight's entire existence was a house of cards, propped up by the myth that he was free, when in reality he was chained to a machine of expenditure that swallowed everything he had. And yet, strangely, it was the peasant who was called unfree, the serf, tied to the land, unable to leave. But the serf could leave if he ran away to a town, and stayed for a year and a day. It happened all the time, and the law sometimes protected him. The knight could not leave. He was bound by blood, by oath, by the expectation of his ancestors who had been knights before him. If he sold his sword and walked away, he would be repudiating his entire lineage. His name would be erased. His children would be nobody. There was no escape clause in the contract of chivalry. So let us go back to that tournament field where the fallen knight is finally lifted upright, gasping, mud dripping from his visor. His opponent has already dismounted and is walking toward him, hand extended in a gesture that looks noble, but is actually a calculation. If he offers to help, he gains public credit for magnanimity, and the fallen knight will owe him a favor. The crowd murmurs approval. The fallen knight accepts the hand, and as he does so, he feels the strain in his lower back, the chafing collar of his mail shirt against his neck, where the skin is already rubbed raw. He smiles inside his helmet, a grimace that no one sees. Tomorrow he will wake with bruises he cannot name, and the day after that he will be called to war, and the day after that he may be dead. But for now, in this moment, he is a knight, and he is alive, and the sun is hot on the metal that is slowly cooking him. Tonight, in the castle hall, the minstrels will sing songs about the valor of combat, and the ladies will smile behind their veils, and the wine will flow, and the knight will sit at the high table with the other warriors, laughing, pretending that he is not, at this very moment, aching in every joint of his body, and secretly wishing he could be anywhere else, even a peasant's hut by the fire, where a man could at least take off his shoes. The peasant's hut, though, was not so easy to reach as the knight might have dreamed. But the door, at least, was his own to close. The knight, after the feast and the wine and the songs, returned to chambers that were cold even in summer, because stone does not hold warmth the way mud and thatch do, and because his bed was a wooden frame with a straw mattress, not so different from the peasant's, except that it was paid for with borrowed silver. And that is the thread I want to pull on next, because if you think the weight of armor was heavy, consider the weight of the ledger. The true cost of being a knight was not measured in battlefield deaths alone. It was measured in acres lost, in heirlooms sold, in daughters married off to old men for a dowry that could buy a new warhorse. A knight's equipment, as I mentioned, could cost as much as a small farm. But that was just the start. A horse worth 30 pounds, a sum that could support a peasant family for several years, might die in a single charge, its leg snapped in a rabbit hole, its neck broken by a fall. A sword, which cost about £1, was a lifetime investment if well cared for, but it could be lost in the chaos of battle or taken as a trophy by an enemy. Armor needed rivets replaced, straps mended, plates hammered back into shape after a dent. Every campaign required spare parts, spare horses, spare servants to carry them. And the knight paid for all of it out of his own purse, drawing on rents from land that was often insufficient to begin with. When I first read the household accounts of a minor English knight from the late 13th century, I was struck by how much of his income went not to food or shelter, but to maintenance of his gear, his horses, his status. He recorded every penny spent on hay, on blacksmith work, on new bridles, on the wages of a single squire who helped him dress. The squire himself was a young man from a similar family, training to become a knight, and he too cost money. His food, his clothes, his own training equipment. The knight was essentially running a small business, and the business's only product was the knight himself, polished and ready for violence. If he failed to maintain that product, if his armor showed rust, if his horse was underfed, he lost his reputation. And without reputation, he could not attract patronage. And without patronage, he was just a man in a tin suit with no income at all. The peasant, meanwhile, owed his lord a fixed amount. So many bushels of wheat, so many chickens, so many days of labor on the lord's domain. It was not easy. It was often unjust. The lord could raise the rents, could demand extra service in times of war, could punish the peasant arbitrarily through the manorial court. But the peasant's obligation was finite. He knew what was expected, and once it was paid, the rest of his harvest was his own. He could not get rich, but he could not be ruined in a single afternoon by the loss of a cow. If his cow died, he could borrow a neighbor's ox for plowing, or slaughter the cow for meat and hope to buy another next year. If the knight's horse died, the knight might face a spiral of debt that would swallow his entire estate. And debt was everywhere in the knightly world. Historians estimate that a significant portion of the English gentry in the late Middle Ages were chronically in arrears, borrowing from Italian bankers, Jewish moneylenders before their expulsion, and later from fellow knights and monasteries. The interest rates could be crushing, sometimes 20 to 30% per year, and the loans were often secured against land. A knight who could not pay might lose his ancestral holding, the very land that gave him his title and his identity. The chronicles are full of stories of old families reduced to poverty, forced to sell their armor, their horses, even their swords, and live as landless sellswords in foreign wars. Some of them ended their days as brigands on the roads they once patrolled. I honestly cannot decide if this is tragic or ironic, or perhaps both. The knight was supposed to be the protector of the land, the defender of order, the embodiment of everything noble. And yet, he was more financially fragile than the peasants he looked down upon. The peasant could lose a harvest to bad weather and still survive, because his needs were modest and his community would help him. The knight could lose one horse and fall into a debt trap that would pull his entire family down with him. The structure of the system was set up to extract wealth upward, from the peasant to the lord, but it also extracted it sideways, from the knight to the armorers and horse dealers and money lenders who knew exactly how to bleed a warrior dry. To me, the most unsettling part of reading these financial records is the smallness of the sums that broke a knight. It was rarely a single catastrophic expense. It was the accumulation of a dozen small ones. A new saddle here, a replacement chainmail collar there, a ransom payment for a cousin who had been captured in a skirmish, a wedding dowry for a daughter that left the knight's coffers empty for years. And all of this had to be done while maintaining the appearance of effortless wealth. A knight could not be seen counting coins or haggling with tradesmen. That would be demeaning. So the debts were hidden, and the knight smiled at feasts and tournaments while secretly knowing that the next harvest would determine whether he could afford to keep his sword. There is a well-known story, possibly apocryphal, but too good not to include, of a German knight in the 15th century who was so deep in debt that he sold his wife's jewelry to buy a new war horse for a campaign. The wife discovered the loss only when she opened her jewelry chest to find it empty, and the knight did not confess until she had wept for 3 days. When he did, he told her that the horse was necessary for his honor, and that her jewels were only ornaments, while his honor was the substance of their life. The wife, according to the story, said nothing, but from that day she stopped wearing any jewelry at all, and the knight noticed that when they walked through the village, the peasants looked at her with more pity than respect. I cannot verify this tale, but it captures something essential. Honor was not free. It was paid for, pound by pound, by everyone around the knight, his wife, his children, his tenants, his horses. Now consider the peasant again. He had no honor to defend in the knightly sense. He had no reputation to maintain among other peasants that required him to spend money he did not have. If his tunic was patched, no one thought less of him. Everyone's tunic was patched. If his shoes leaked, he stuffed them with straw and carried on. The only judgment he faced was from his lord, and that judgment was about his labor, not his appearance. The peasant could be poor without being ashamed, because poverty was his natural condition. The knight could not be poor. Poverty for a knight was a failure not just of fortune, but of character. It meant he was not worthy of his ancestors. It meant he had failed the code. And so the knight borrowed and borrowed and borrowed, trying to look like what he was supposed to be, until the borrowings themselves consumed him. There's a passage in a French romance from the 12th century that describes a knight riding through a forest, his armor dented and his horse limping. And the poet takes time to tell us that the knight is thinking not of love or glory, but of the debt he owes to the armorer in Lyon. I remember reading that and laughing, because it was so unexpected, a courtly romance pausing to mention a debt to an armorer. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the poet was being more honest than many chroniclers. The debt was real. It was always there, riding alongside the knight, heavier than his shield. The economic trap also explains something puzzling about medieval warfare. Why knights were so eager to capture each other rather than kill. A dead enemy was worth nothing. A captured one, however, was a walking ransom check. The entire system of chivalric warfare was, in many ways, a credit economy built on the promise of ransom. A knight captured in battle could expect to pay a year's income or more to buy his freedom. and he would sign a bond, secure it against his land, and go home to spend the next decade paying it off. Sometimes he was released on parole to raise the money, trusting his word of honor that he would return if he could not pay. And many did return voluntarily to captivity, because the alternative was to lose their name entirely. There is a peculiar kind of dignity in that, I suppose, but it is a dignity born of economic necessity. When I first read the numbers, the ransom demands, the debts, the interest payments, I was struck by how similar the system was to modern consumer debt. A knight bought a horse on credit, just as a modern person buys a car on a loan. He made monthly installments, fell behind, and faced the loss of his asset. The armorers and horse dealers were not unlike modern lenders, offering easy payment plans that ultimately tied the knight to a lifetime of repayment. And the tournament circuit was like a professional sports league. Knights traveled from event to event, competing for prize money and glory, hoping to win enough to cover their expenses. But most won nothing and went home poorer. By the end of the 14th century, some knights were so burdened by debt that they began to refuse calls to war, claiming illness or poverty. The king would then send commissioners to investigate, and the records of these investigations are heartbreaking. Knights who had sold their horses, their armor, even their ancestral swords, sitting in empty halls with no way to fulfill their feudal obligations. Some were stripped of their knighthood. Others simply disappeared from the records, leaving behind only the memory of a name. The peasant, I should note, also had debts. He owed labor, owed rent, owed the church its tithe. But his debts were in kind, not in coin, and they were capped by custom. The Lord could not arbitrarily increase the peasant's obligations beyond what tradition allowed, not without risking rebellion, and rebellion was expensive. The knight had no such protection. His debts were in coin, and coin had no custom. The money lender could demand whatever the contract said, and the contract said everything. So when you picture a knight, do not picture only the shining armor and the plume. Picture also the ledger book, the scratched out entries, the anxious counting of coins by lamplight. Picture the wife who no longer wears her jewels. Picture the horse dealer waiting outside the gate, expecting payment. Picture a man who cannot sleep because he owes a sum he cannot name, and whose only way out is to ride into battle and hope to capture someone richer than himself. And then picture the peasant who wakes, lights his fire, and owes nothing but the day's labor. He does not own much, but he does not owe much either. And there is a freedom in that which the knight, for all his pride, could never understand. But the knight was also trapped in another way, one that had nothing to do with money. Because even if he paid off his debts, even if he rode a healthy horse and wore fresh armor, he could never escape the thing that made him a knight in the first place. He was trained from boyhood to fight, and sooner or later, someone would ask him to prove it. The tournament field was one thing, controlled and scored. The battlefield was another. And on the battlefield, the armor that cost a fortune became something else entirely. a target. The battlefield did not announce itself with a trumpet blast. It arrived as a shift in the air, a strange stillness in the birds, a distant tremor that might have been thunder or might have been hooves. And the knight, standing in his stirrups to scan the horizon, felt his stomach tight in a way that no amount of training had ever taught him to control. He had been told since boyhood that courage was the suppression of fear, that a true knight felt no terror. But the body does not lie. The sweat that soaked his gambeson before a single blow was struck, the tremor in his hands as he adjusted his grip on the lance, the sudden dryness in his throat that made swallowing an effort. These were not signs of weakness. They were signs of being alive and knowing it. The peasant, if he was lucky, heard the news of the approaching army from a safe distance. He gathered his family, his livestock if he had time, and fled into the woods. There was no shame in it. The woods were familiar territory, full of hiding places, streams to drink from, roots to eat if the campaign dragged on. The peasant had no duty to fight. His duty was to survive, to rebuild, to return when the soldiers had moved on. He might lose his hut, his stored grain, his few possessions, but he would keep his life. And his life, unglamorous as it was his own. The knight did not have that option. He could not flee. Flight was the one unforgivable sin in the code of chivalry, the act that erased a man's name from every record, that made his children bear the stain of cowardice for generations. He had to stay. He had to ride toward the enemy, not away from him. He had to sit on his horse in the front line, watching the opposing army form up, counting the lances, the banners, the glint of steel in the morning light, and know that within the hour he might be dead, or, worse, captured and held for ransom in a dungeon that would make a peasant's hut look like a palace. When I first read the account of a knight who described the moments before a battle as a kind of paralysis, he could not think, could not feel, could only stare at a single point on the horizon and breathe. I was struck by how honest it was. Most chronicles skip the waiting. They begin with the charge, the clash, the heroics, but the waiting could last hours. And in those hours, a man had time to think about everything he had left undone, every debt unpaid, every word unsaid. He had time to wonder if his armor was strapped tightly enough, if his horse would hold, if the enemy's lances were longer than his own. He had time to be afraid, and the fear was not abstract. It was specific. The knight knew exactly what could happen to him. He had seen it happen to others. A lance could punch through a visor and enter the eye socket. A sword could find the gap between breastplate and backplate, where the chain mail was weakest. A mace could crush a helmet without penetrating it, scrambling the brain inside like an egg. A knight could be pulled from his horse and pinned to the ground by the weight of his own armor, unable to move, while enemy soldiers gathered around him like butchers, looking for the vulnerable points. That was the terror that never appeared in the songs. The songs spoke of glorious death. The reality was a slow, humiliating suffocation in the mud, with your own armor as your coffin. I have no definitive answer for why men continued to do this generation after generation, why the system did not collapse under the weight of its own brutality. Partly, of course, because there was no alternative. A man born into the knightly class had no other trade, no other identity. But also, I suspect, because the fear was transformed into something else by the communal experience of battle. When a man charges alongside his comrades, when the line of lances lowers together, when the horses break into a gallop, and the ground shakes, and the war cries rise, something happens to the brain. The fear does not disappear, but it becomes submerged under a rush of adrenaline and noise and movement. The knight stops thinking and becomes a machine of muscle and steel. But the battle does not last forever. And when it ends, whether in victory or defeat, the knight has to live with what he has done. This is another part of the story that the songs omit. The songs tell of the hero's triumph, the captured banner, the defeated foe. They do not tell of the knight who, in the heat of combat, killed a man so young that he still had no beard, and saw the boy's face as he fell. They do not tell of the knight who spent the night after the battle vomiting from shock, or the one who could not stop shaking for 3 days, or the one who, years later, still woke in the dark, convinced that he was back on that field, with blood in his mouth and a dead horse on his leg. To me, the most unsettling part is not the violence itself, but the silence that surrounded it. There was no concept of post-traumatic stress in the Middle Ages. There was no vocabulary for the nightmares, the flashbacks, the constant hypervigilance. A knight who complained of such things would have been told to pray, or to drink less wine, or to stop being a woman. He had to swallow it all. He had to bury every memory under the next campaign, the next tournament, the next fight. And the memories did not stay buried. They surfaced at odd moments, in the middle of a feast, at the sound of a door slamming, in the cry of a wounded animal. The knight would go pale, excuse himself, and no one would ask why. The peasant, in his own way, also experienced violence. His village could be burned, his family killed, his fields trampled. But he was not the instrument of violence. He was its victim, and there is a different kind of psychological weight to being a victim versus being an agent. The peasant could blame the soldiers. He could hate them without ambivalence. The knight could not hate his enemy in the same way, because he was them. He was the soldier. He had done to other villages what was done to his own. And he carried that knowledge with him, a second skin beneath the armor. And then there was the constant fear of the tournament. Tournaments were not the safe sport we sometimes imagine. They were full contact, often deadly, and a knight who performed poorly could lose not only his reputation, but his life. The Merlée, a large-scale mock battle involving dozens or even hundreds of knights, was particularly dangerous. Men died in them regularly, trampled by horses, crushed in the press, stabbed by lances that had not been properly blunted. The church condemned tournaments for centuries, not because they were violent. The church was comfortable with violence in a just war, but because they were vain, prideful, and often fatal for no good reason. But the knights kept holding them, Because tournaments were where reputations were made, where patrons noticed a man, where a skilled fighter could win prize money, and more importantly, the favor of a wealthy lord. I recall a story from the early 14th century about a knight who was unhorsed in a melee and landed badly, breaking his arm in 3 places. He refused to yield, continued fighting on foot with his sword in his other hand, and eventually won the bout. His arm was never set properly, and he carried a crooked limb for the rest of his life. He was celebrated in poems as a paragon of knightly virtue. But when I read the medical description of his injury, a compound fracture that became infected, healed poorly, and left him in constant pain, I could not see the heroism. I saw a man who had been conditioned to ignore his own body's warnings and who paid for it every day for the next 40 years. Now think about the peasant again. He also suffered injuries: a broken leg from a fall, a crushed hand from a millstone, a back ruined by decades of bending over a plow. But his suffering was private. No one wrote poems about it. No one expected him to pretend it did not hurt. He could limp, and everyone understood. He could stay home from the fields, and his family would tend to him. The knight, by contrast, was expected to fight through every injury. A knight with a broken arm was still expected to attend the tournament, to ride in the campaign, to hold his lance. If he did not, he was suspected of malingering. And malingering was the first step toward being called a coward. There is a particular cruelty in this. The body of a knight was not his own. It belonged to his lord, to his king, to his code. He could not rest when it needed rest. He could not heal when it needed healing. He drove it forward year after year until it broke completely. And then he was discarded. The chronicles are full of old knights who lived on in poverty, their lands sold, their armor pawned, their names forgotten. They had given everything to their calling, and the calling had used them up and moved on. So the next time you imagine a medieval battlefield, do not imagine only the charge and the clash. Imagine also the night before, when the knight lies awake in his tent, listening to the wind, and thinks about the morning. Imagine the weight in his chest, the tightness in his throat, the knowledge that he might not see the sunset. Imagine that he has no choice. He cannot walk away. He cannot hide in the woods. He must ride out and fight, and either kill or be killed, and then do it again and again until his body or his mind gives way. And then imagine the peasant, hidden in those woods, listening to the same wind. He is cold. He is hungry. His hut may be burned by morning, but he has chosen his own survival. He has made a decision that the night cannot make. And in that small, stubborn choice, there is a freedom that the night will never know. But the night does not last forever. Dawn comes, and with it the orders. The knight mounts his horse, checks his girth, lowers his visor. The world narrows to a slit of gray sky and green field. He cannot see the faces of the men he will kill. He cannot see the faces of the men who will try to kill him. He sees only the banner of his captain and the distant line of the enemy and the ground that lies between them. and he charges. The charge ended not with a triumphant cry, but with a thud and a snap. The knight's lance struck something solid, a shield, a chest, the neck of a horse, and the impact traveled up his arm, through his shoulder, and into his spine with a force that he would feel for weeks. Then he was past the enemy line, wheeling his horse, looking for the next target, and his body was already screaming at him. The adrenaline masked it for a few more minutes, maybe an hour. But eventually the battle would end, the blood would cool, and the pain would arrive in full. That pain was not a single thing. It was a constellation. It lived in the joints, the knees and hips that had absorbed the shocks of 1,000 charges. It lived in the lower back, where the weight of the armor pressed down on the spine hour after hour, year after year. It lived in the hands, the knuckles swollen from gripping the reins, and the sword hilt through countless battles. It lived in the neck, where the helmet's weight had slowly compressed the vertebrae. And it lived in the mind, where memories of violence replayed themselves without invitation, where the face of a man killed in a tournament 20 years ago could appear without warning in the middle of a quiet evening. When I first read the skeletal remains of a late medieval knight excavated from a battlefield grave, the archaeologist's report noted something that stopped me cold. The man's spine showed advanced degenerative changes, the kind usually seen in elderly laborers. But this knight had died in his early 30s. His knees were worn down to the bone in places. His right shoulder bore evidence of multiple healed fractures. His teeth were ground flat, probably from clenching his jaw under stress. He was, in biological terms, an old man at 30. And he had died not in his bed, but in the mud, with a sword wound through his ribs. The peasant, too, aged young. A lifetime of bending over a plow, of hauling heavy loads, of sleeping in damp huts, took its toll. The peasant's spine also curved, his hands also gnarled, his teeth also rotted. But there was a difference, and I think it matters. The peasant's body broke down from the outside in, worn down by the elements, by repetitive labor, by malnutrition. The knight's body broke down from the inside out, worn down by violence, by the constant tension of anticipating violence, by the armor that was supposed to protect him, but instead became a second skeleton that ground against his real one. And then there were the injuries that never healed properly. A broken rib that was not set, because the knight could not afford to stop fighting long enough to let it heal. A torn ligament in the knee that stiffened into a permanent limp. A concussion that left the knight with headaches and dizziness for the rest of his life. The medieval medical understanding of these injuries was rudimentary at best. A broken bone could be splinted, but the knight would be back in the saddle within weeks, and the bone would heal crooked. A head injury was treated with bleeding, which probably made things worse. An infection was treated with prayer and poultices, and if the infection spread, the knight died. I recall a story from the 15th century about a French knight who was struck in the face by a mace during a skirmish. The impact shattered his cheekbone, and pushed fragments of bone into his sinus cavity. He survived, but the wound never fully closed. For the rest of his life, he had a hole in his face that whistled when he breathed. He wore a leather patch over it, but the patch could not stop the constant drainage, the smell, the stares. He stopped attending court. He stopped going to tournaments. He became a recluse in his own castle, tended only by his wife and a single servant. The chronicle that records his story does not mention his name, only his misfortune. He had been a celebrated knight before the injury. After it, he was nothing. To me, the most unsettling part of reading these accounts is the way the body's decay was hidden, even from the knight himself. He was trained to ignore pain, to push through it, to treat his own flesh as an enemy to be subdued. And so he did not notice, or did not admit, that his body was slowly accumulating damage that would never be repaired. He woke each morning, stretched his aching back, pulled on his gambeson, and told himself that this was normal, that all men felt this way, that the stiffness would pass once he started moving. But it did not pass. It accumulated. And one day, usually in his 40s or 50s if he lived that long, he would wake and find that he could not get out of bed. His joints would refuse. His back would lock. His hands would no longer grip a sword. And he would lie there, staring at the stone ceiling, wondering what he had done to deserve a body that had betrayed him. The peasant's body also betrayed him, but later and with less cruelty. Because the peasant's body was allowed to be tired, he could sit down at the end of the day. He could rest on Sunday. The church insisted on it. He could stop working when the pain became too great, and his family would not accuse him of cowardice. The peasant's body broke down, yes, but it broke down slowly, over a lifetime of honest labor, and the peasant was not expected to pretend otherwise. The knight's body was expected to perform until the moment it died. There was no retirement for a knight, no pension, no quiet cottage by the river, no peaceful old age watching grandchildren play. A knight died in the saddle, or died in a tournament, or died in a feud, or died in his bed at 60, with a body that had given out decades earlier. The ones who survived into old age were often the most broken, because they had been fighting the longest. I think of the old knights described in the chronicles, men in their 50s and 60s, who could barely walk, who had to be lifted onto their horses, who sat in council with their hands shaking and their eyes watering, and who were still expected to ride to war when the king called. Some of them must have prayed for death. Some of them must have ridden into battle hoping that this time the enemy would finish what age had started. The body was not the only thing that decayed. The mind, too, accumulated damage. The knight who had killed a dozen men in battle was not the same as the man who had never killed. He carried each death with him, stored somewhere in the folds of memory, and the weight of them grew heavier over time. Some knights turned to drink. Some turned to religion, joining monasteries in their old age, hoping to pray away the faces that haunted them. Some turned cruel, taking out their pain on the peasants and servants around them. And some simply turned silent, sitting in the corner of the hall, staring into the fire, speaking to no one. I honestly cannot decide if this is better or worse than the peasant's fate. The peasant also lost family, also saw violence, also suffered. But the peasant's suffering was communal. He grieved with his neighbors in public, with rituals that gave shape to loss. The knight's suffering was solitary. He could not show it. He could not speak of it. He had to sit at the high table and smile while his mind was burning. Now consider what it meant to live with chronic pain, untreated for decades. There were no effective painkillers in the Middle Ages. Opium was known, but expensive and rarely available. Alcohol was the most common analgesic, and many knights drank heavily, not for pleasure, but to dull the constant ache. Wine in the morning, wine with every meal, wine at night to fall asleep. The knight in the songs is often depicted as a cheerful drinker, raising his cup in celebration. But I suspect many of those raised cups were lifted by men who were simply trying to quiet the screaming in their joints. And the armor itself was a source of chronic misery. The metal plates rubbed against the chainmail, which rubbed against the padded gambeson, which rubbed against the skin. Every knight had calluses in places that are hard to imagine. The chafing could become infected, especially in hot weather, when sweat pooled between the layers. The famous armor rust that appears in poems and romances was not just a metaphor for neglect. It was a literal problem. Sweat rusted the inside of armor, and the rust flakes got into the padding, and the padding rubbed the rust into the skin, and the skin became raw and weeping. A knight in the field for a long campaign might develop sores that never healed, constantly irritated by the movement of the armor, and he had no way to treat them except to remove the armor and risk infection from the open air. I think of a knight on campaign in the summer of some forgotten year, sitting by a stream at dusk, his armor piled beside him. He has taken off his gambeson and is examining the raw patches on his shoulders, the places where the chain mail has worn through the padding. He dips a cloth in the cold water and presses it to the wounds. The relief lasts only a moment. Tomorrow he will put it all back on, and the sores will open again, and the cycle will continue until the campaign ends or he dies. But there is no record of this moment. No chronicler thought it worth noting. The knight's suffering was invisible, unworthy of song, buried under the pageantry of chivalry. And the knight himself would never have spoken of it. He would have called it a minor inconvenience, a price of honor, a small sacrifice. And perhaps to him it was. But I wonder if, in those quiet moments by the stream, when no one was watching and the pain was fresh, he ever doubted the price that was being asked. The knight sat by the stream long after the water had gone cold on his wounded shoulders, and he thought about something he had not allowed himself to think in years. He thought about the end. Not the end of a battle or a campaign or a season of tournaments, but the end of everything, the moment when he would no longer be a knight, because he would no longer be anything at all. It was a strange thought to have in the middle of a war, with the sounds of the camp drifting through the trees behind him, but it came nevertheless, unbidden, and it settled in his chest like a stone. What would it mean, he wondered, to have been a knight? Would anyone remember his name? Would his children carry it forward? Or would they sell his armor and his land and become something else entirely? And if they did, would that be a betrayal? Or would it be a kind of mercy? He had no answers. He only had the cold water, the raw skin, and the distant fires of the camp where his comrades were drinking and laughing, unaware that one of their number was sitting alone in the dark, asking questions that had no answers. When I first read A Knight's Will from the early 15th century, I was struck by how small it was. The man had owned almost nothing of value by the end of his life. His armor was listed, but it was described as old and patched. His horse was lame in the left foreleg. His sword was notched from many blows. He left his wife a small plot of land that was already mortgaged, and his sons a debt that would take them years to repay. He died, as far as the records show, in his own bed, but the bed was not his. It belonged to his eldest son, who had taken over the estate because the father could no longer manage it. The knight's final years were spent as a dependent in his own home, eating at his son's table, wearing clothes that his daughter-in-law had mended. He had outlived his usefulness, and he knew it. The peasant, by contrast, often died in the same hut where he had been born, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, with a life that was poor in goods, but rich in continuity. The peasant's world was small, but it was coherent. He knew his place in it. He knew the names of the fields, the habits of the seasons, the faces of his neighbors. He knew that his son would plow the same furrows, that his daughter would marry a man from the next village, that his grandchildren would be baptized in the same stone church where his own parents had been married. There was a kind of wholeness to that, a completeness that the knight's fractured, nomadic existence could never match. The knight lived his life in fragments. He moved from castle to castle, from war to war, from tournament to tournament. He knew the inside of tents and great halls, but he rarely knew the same room for more than a few months at a time. His friendships were forged in violence and dissolved when the campaign ended. His marriage was often a transaction, his children raised by servants while he was away. He came home to a wife who was a stranger and children who flinched when he tried to embrace them. And then he left again, because the king called, or the Lord demanded, or his own restless honor would not let him stay. To me, the most unsettling part of this is not the physical hardship, which was real but shared in different forms by everyone in the Middle Ages. It is the loneliness. The knight was surrounded by people, squires, servants, fellow warriors, ladies, lords, but he was rarely known. He was seen as a role, a function, a weapon. No one asked him what he wanted. No one cared if he was happy. He was not supposed to be happy. He was supposed to be honorable. And honor, as I have come to understand it through these stories, is a terrible substitute for happiness. There's a story I came across in a monastic chronicle from the 12th century, so brief that it barely qualifies as a story at all. but it has stayed with me. A knight, old and crippled, came to the monastery gate and asked to be admitted as a lay brother. The abbot asked him why he wished to end his days in prayer rather than in the world. The knight replied that he had spent his whole life learning to kill, and now he wanted to learn how to die. The abbot admitted him. The chronicle does not say what happened to him afterward. It does not say whether he found peace, or whether the faces of the men he had killed continued to visit him at night. It only records that he came, and that he was accepted, and that he was never seen again outside the monastery walls. I think of that night often, especially when I consider the ending of the story. He spent his youth in armor, his middle age in debt, his old age in pain, and his final years in silence, trying to unlearn everything he had been taught. It is a bleak picture, I know, but I do not think the peasant's life was idyllic either. The peasant died young, too, of disease or starvation, or the casual violence of the lords above him. The peasant's children died in infancy at rates that would horrify us. The peasant's world was narrow, and narrowness has its own kind of suffering. What I am saying is not that the knight had it worse in every way, but that the knight's suffering was compounded by a lie. The lie that he was free, that he was noble, that he was something more than a tool of violence with a gilded handle. The peasant had no such lie. He knew he was a peasant. He knew he would die a peasant. And in that knowledge, there was a strange and bitter peace. The knight was told he was a hero, and he believed it, and the belief cost him everything. Let me take you to a scene that I have carried with me for years, though I cannot verify its accuracy. It comes from a French manuscript illustration, not a written account, so the details are left to the imagination. An old knight sits on a bench outside a castle gate. He is no longer wearing armor. He wears a simple tunic, patched at the elbows. His hands rest on his knees, and they are swollen, the knuckles misshapen. His face is lined, and his eyes are fixed on something in the middle distance, a field, perhaps, or a memory. Beside him, a younger man stands, wearing the knight's old sword belt. The young man is talking, gesturing, full of energy. The old man does not respond. He only sits and watches and waits. The illustration is titled in the manuscript simply The Retired Knight. There is no text to explain what he is thinking, but I imagine he is thinking about a morning long ago when he was young and unarmored, standing in a field before his first tournament. He felt the same fear that he would later learn to hide. He felt the same uncertainty about whether he would survive the day. But there was also something else, a kind of hope, a belief that honor was real and that he could earn it. And now, decades later, sitting on this bench, he is trying to remember what that hope felt like and whether it was worth the price. I have no definitive answer to that question. I do not think the knight himself could have answered it. The price was paid in installments over a lifetime, and by the end, the total was so large that it could not be added up. The armor that had cost a farm, the horse that had cost a dowry, the ransom that had cost a decade of freedom, they were all gone now, consumed by the machine of chivalry. What remained was the body, and the memories, and the bench outside the gate. The peasant, I imagine, might have sat on a similar bench, outside his own hut, in the last light of a summer evening. He would have been tired, yes, but his tiredness was the tiredness of a day's work done, not of a lifetime's war. He would have watched his grandchildren play in the dirt, and he would have known that they would live the same life he had lived, and he would have felt, perhaps, a kind of contentment. Not happiness, exactly. That word feels too modern for the medieval world, but acceptance. He was part of something that continued. He would die, but the furrows would still be plowed. The wheat would still be harvested. The seasons would still turn. The night had no such continuity. He was a peak, not a plateau. He rose, shone, and fell, and what came after him was not the same furrow, but a different field entirely. His sons might not be knights. His name might be forgotten. The castle that had been his home might fall into ruin, its stones taken for other buildings, its hall filled with nettles and bird droppings. In the end, all that remained of a knight was a rusted helm in a museum case, and a few lines in a chronicle that no one reads. And yet, I must admit, there is something in the knight's story that draws us still. We do not write songs about peasants. We do not make films about the quiet dignity of a man who spent his life in the same field. We are drawn to the armor, the sword, the charge, the risk. We are drawn to the lie, perhaps, because it is more dramatic than the truth. The lie says that glory is real, that honor is worth dying for, that a man can become something more than himself by riding into battle. The truth says that glory is a debt, honor is a cage, and the man in the armor is just a man, cold and tired and afraid. I think the knight at the monastery gate understood this. He had spent his life learning to kill, and now he wanted to learn how to die. He wanted to unlearn the lie. I do not know if he succeeded. The chronicle does not say. But I like to imagine that he did, that he spent his final years in the quiet of the cloister, learning to sit still, learning to breathe, learning to be a man instead of a knight. The last image I want to leave you with is not of a battlefield or a tournament or a castle hall. It is of a small field at dusk, in no particular year, in no particular kingdom. A peasant is walking home from his day's labor, his scythe over his shoulder. He is tired, but his tiredness is the good kind, the kind that comes from honest work. He stops at the edge of the field and looks back at the furrows he has cut, straight and true. There is no one watching him. No one will sing songs about his work. No one will remember his name. But the furrows are there in the earth, and they will be there tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. And somewhere beyond the field, beyond the trees, beyond the river, a knight is mounting his horse. He does not know where he is going. He only knows that he must go. The sun is setting, and the shadows are long, and he rides toward them. If you would like to travel again, we could visit another time, a different century, a different story, a different kind of truth. The road is long, but it does not have to end here.